Hi, you've tuned in to Radio Northern Beaches, your Listen Local station, right here on the Northern Beaches of Sydney. You can find us on your radio dial at 88.7 and 90.3 FM. Can't get to a radio? No worries. You can always stream our program live from anywhere in the world at rnb.org.au. And for listening on your own schedule, our podcasts are available globally at rnbpodcast.com.au. So be sure to follow and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Now, here is our latest podcast.
Hello again, listeners to Community Radio Northern Beaches, 88.7 and 90.3 FM, streaming live on our website, www.rnb.org.au, our program, Community Voices. I'm Michael Lester. God makes all things good, man meddles with them, and they become evil. I'm talking about a very celebrated book from the 18th century by the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a book called Émile, or subtitled On Education. It's been quite influential over the years in shaping views about what is education and, in fact, what is the ideal citizen, if you like, and where does education fit in doing that? Rousseau begins from a position where he thinks, as that opening quote implies, people and children are actually all born good and virtuous, but they're only, in a sense, corrupted, and I think that's a word he might use, in their values and beliefs and activities by the institutions and norms and pressures of a society. And I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity for us to welcome to our program somebody who's made a very long and deep study of these things. I'm talking about Sally Scholtz. Sally is a professor of philosophy at Villanova University in Pennsylvania in the States, from where she's joining us. She recently penned a most fascinating short article in the American Scholar called Learning to be Social. What might Rousseau teach us about how to live with others? So I'm delighted, Sally, that you're able to join us from Pennsylvania. Let's start, perhaps where you start the essay, in a sense. It really starts with the proposition that Émile, who is the subject of this so-called novel, and we're hearing from his tutor about how Émile should be brought up. The whole objective of Émile's education in the tutor's eyes is to keep the young Émile well away from any social influences on his education and learning, and that he should just be able to engage in natural development away from these corrupting influences. Is that the source? And if so, why does he believe so strongly that it's important to keep the education natural?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that is the aim. Rousseau believed that, as you read from the quote, that we are made naturally good, but that we've allowed society to, in some sense, develop away from nature. And so the idea with Emile is to develop the child in accordance with nature. But in order to do that, we have to actually start with nature and try as best as possible to cater the education without all of the social influences. So this private tutor raised in the countryside is the model that Rousseau gives us. Of course, he recognizes that it's idealistic and that most of his own contemporaries wouldn't be able to replicate the style of education. But it's not so much about following the strictures of hiring an individual tutor and doing that. Instead, it's about paying attention to what's inside each human being. And so nature presents us as curious, right? Children are incredibly curious and spend a good bit of our formalized education learning instead to conform to a set of rules. And so Rousseau wants to try to instead tap into the natural curiosity and let the child lead.
Before we explore what he might mean by this natural education or natural development, and there have been many attempts over the centuries since then and decades even today to have a more child-centered development, I think it's called, latterly. What is the root of the concern about the way in which exposure to social rules and norms actually contribute or detracts from the ability to develop a good and ideal citizen?
Oh, it's a great question. For Rousseau, Rousseau is often called the philosopher of freedom, and he's also called the philosopher of equality. And he believes that freedom is one of those natural characteristics or natural traits that we have. But when we are raised with the social rules guiding our education or guiding our life, we instead learn a sort of conformity or docility, to use his word, that it makes us dependent. So we actually give up some of our freedom. In another book, he talks about these in terms of yokes, as in the sort of harness that one puts on cattle to guide them in plowing a field. We create in society our own yokes. There's a great example that Rousseau himself, I'll say, suffered from. So I'll use that. In his day, men wore lace cuffs. So on their shirts, hanging out of their coat, they would have these ornate lace cuffs. And the style of those lace cuffs would change every year. Well, of course, the style, only people who had the means could afford to keep up with the changing of the style. So lace cuffs were not just a fashion sense. They were also, in the end, an indication of inequality as well, because only the wealthy could keep up with the changing in the style. So he himself felt the tension with this because he could never afford the lace cuffs. And so he tried to, in some sense, incorporate his own sense of social inequality into the education, and to try as best as possible to create a system of education that avoids the lessons that support and sustain inequality. Instead, he wanted us to be free and equal. But in order to be free and equal, we have to actually cast off some of the expectations that hinder us or yoke us to a social framework, a set of social expectations that so few of us can actually meet. In our own day, we've got all sorts of different examples of this. Having the latest iPhone, for instance, or having you can think of it in terms of keeping up with the Joneses, having the best house on the block, the best kitchen, whatever it is. And these are, in some sense, social trappings that actually hinder our freedom rather than support it. So his ideal citizen is a free citizen, someone who is making decisions along with fellow citizens for the good of the whole, rather than trying to compete always with fellow citizens.
In talking about natural development and leaving children free to develop naturally, I think he uses terms like, let the child see the necessity of things and the nature of things rather than the will and the caprices of capricious men of their orders. How important is this distinction of his?
It's an excellent question. And Emile Rousseau holds off on teaching the child how to read until the kid is something like 11 or 12 years old. So we read this and are kind of appalled that the child has not been exposed to books and reading at that stage or in the earlier stages. And I think Rousseau has a real organized or systemic plan for this reading. And it is, in fact, addressing exactly your question. He wants the child to be dependent only on himself and on God and on the virtues. So in looking at the world around Emile can find all of his playthings there in his environment. So he digs in the garden. He traipses through the forest. He splashes in streams. He doesn't need prefabricated toys, right? The learning and the play, which is the child's work, is everywhere around him. And he becomes dependent on himself rather than on externally provided entertainment. The dependency that you pointed to is a little bit obscure or nuanced in the Emile, and in saying dependent on things, he's saying, look at the world about you. Don't become dependent on the things that society tells you to be dependent upon. So we can think of ourselves in this and how dependent we've become on the telephone and in particular the smartphone. We all have our smartphones in our pockets all the time. And there's something very dangerous, according to Rousseau, about being so dependent on this technology. And think about the feelings that we experience when we misplace this treasured item. It feels as if we've lost part of ourselves in some sense. And Rousseau never wanted his Emile to experience that. So that I started with the story of learning to read. The first book that Emile is allowed to read is Robinson Crusoe. It's a wonderful book about independence and virtue. Robinson Crusoe, as we all know, is stuck on this island, and he must fend for himself. He must discover within himself all that he needs to live. So that when he is reunited with society, or when each of us, I should say, is ready to be introduced into society, And Emile himself isn't introduced until that foot race I mentioned in the article in his early teens, 12, 13 years old. When we're first introduced into society, we are already a full person. So we don't have to rely on the opinions of others. We don't become dependent on what other people think of us or dependent on other people providing us entertainment. Instead, we've got everything we need within ourselves, just like Robinson Crusoe did.
Our guest here on Radio Northern Beaches Community Voices is Sally Scholtz, Professor of Philosophy at Villanova University in Pennsylvania, from where she's joining us on the line. And we're talking about the classic work on education from the 18th century by the French philosopher Rousseau called Emile, and Sally's essay about this, Learning to be Social, recently in the American Scholar. He has much to say in this book about the role of parents and parenting in this education. But to give some further point, perhaps, to the point we were just discussing, what is his treatment of the way in which children cry and use tears and the way parents should react to this? How does this exemplify what he says about confronting necessities rather than will?
Yes. So Rousseau is concerned with domination. And one of the things that he sees is that parents can inadvertently teach their children to become dominating. And we do that in part when we respond to their tantrums, if I can use those terms. So Rousseau wants us to be very cautious in responding to children who don't have genuine needs, but who are seeking, in some sense, to dominate. Now, he's not accusing children of intentionally dominating, but children very quickly learn that how their parents respond to them is, in some sense, their own control of those parents. So if parents respond too quickly to children's tears or their tantrums, then the child sees this as a tool to manipulate the parents. And so it's all about trying to avoid domination, but also to try to meet the needs of the child. Now, Rousseau does think that most of the parents of his, and in particular, when he says parents, he tends to have in mind the upper class parents. Most of the parents tended to treat their children as he put it, as little men rather than as children. So he had a long list of things that he asked parents to avoid doing. Parents would, in his time, wealthy parents send their child out to a wet nurse for a few years, someone who would actually nurse the child, the newborn baby, until it was 2 or 3 years old and ready to re-enter, quote unquote, polite society. And so then the wealthy parents would welcome this 3-year-old back as if the child was a fully grown human being. And of course, that's what Rousseau is, or one of the things Rousseau is countering in his own system of education. He's trying to say, no, we don't want to teach our children to be dominated or to dominate. So we don't want them to conform to social expectations, but nor do we want them to adopt the habits of trying to control other people. And being a good citizen involves just that. We have to humbly come together as fellow citizens, not to dominate and manipulate each other, but instead to try to learn from one another. I'll just mention that some of this education might start to sound familiar to people who are familiar with Montessori schools or the Montessori system. And Montessori was greatly influenced by Emile, and so set up these schools to allow children to follow their curiosity and to, in some sense, take the lead in the education. But the tutors, the guides, provide a safe environment in which the student can develop as a free, independent human being.
Following curiosity and independence is one thing, but a persistent theme in Emile, I think, and his education is the suppression of the emergence of desires and will, and the idea that you're at risk if you desire and want things which at the end of the day are neither necessary or perhaps even achievable. This is a big theme underlying his education, but it's a theme underlying what he considers the ills of society, isn't it?
Yes. And I think here we would want to separate will and desire just a bit, because Rousseau does recognize that the will, as in our voluntary system, the how we choose, is important. It's important as citizens. What we want to hope for is something of an alignment between our particular wills and the general will, but they'll never be completely aligned. But as citizens, we're supposed to think of the general will, and the general will focuses on when people think of what is good for the communal whole, if each person was thinking of what is good for the communal whole, that would result in the sort of general will. And Rousseau's a little bit vague on this, and it's a very controversial idea, lots of different interpretations, but it ends up being something along the lines of a common good that emerges from the people and the particularity of the people and the location they're in.
Sally, Rousseau in Émile makes a very significant distinction, doesn't he, I believe, between two types of self-esteem and self-regard. In the French, I think, known as amour de soi and amour de propre, the former being a self-regard and esteem that flows from within the person and doesn't rely on the regard and worth that others might put on the person, whereas the form of propre, if you like, is almost a selfishness and a vanity that is almost purely dependent on the opinions and values placed on you by others. Is this a core distinction to which he tries to work with his prescriptions and ideas for education?
Yes, absolutely. And you're a very astute reader of Rousseau. I think one of the points that I like to stress is that amour propre doesn't have to be that way, but we've allowed it to develop that way. And so we now live in society. We have to live in society. We've got to figure out how to keep our vanity in check, essentially. And in order to do that, Rousseau sees this system of education as trying as best as possible to recover the natural individual and the self regard that comes from within.
And kind of related to the points that we've been talking about too, I think, and you might have made some allusion to this, has to do with an education that he advocates that creates a bit of humility among people and a recognition of the value and worth of others, even though individual people have very differing values, qualities, attributes to bring to society. And I think he calls for an education that builds a form of generous empathy, is it, as distinct from a vanity and a hubris?
That's right. The generous empathy, I think both terms are very telling for Rousseau, because generosity isn't rooted in money or how much you have and how much you can give. It's instead rooted in the spirit of generosity, or what we would call the spirit of generosity. It's how we share ourselves with others and how we share what it is that we bring to community, our own talents and gifts to community. If we do that out of humility, there's a genuine desire then to be together as community. But if we do it out of a sense of heightening our own vanity or heightening our own promotion, we're not being generous. We're just we're leaning into amour propre and our vanity. So here I tend to think of the way we've allowed reality television, celebrity influencers to take over so much of our social existence, whereas Rousseau really values something like a simple festival, a church gathering, a place where we can all appreciate one another and our uniqueness without feeling that we're being measured against or by one another.
Is this something that Rousseau advocates can be put in place in the early years of Émile's education through into his teen years to build away from, I think you've described what might be a vain self-absorption that fuels social division? What is it in the education and his natural education that would tend to keep the young Émile from becoming self-absorbed in this vain way?
Yeah, good. Well, so two things. One is just the sort of structure of Émile's education. He is taught by himself. He has a single student, a single tutor. That is not something that we can replicate easily in this day and age. But I think that we can nevertheless capture some of the spirit of what Émile wants. And I tried to capture in the essay some of what he means by teaching the child humility and generosity. It's allowing the student to take appropriate risks and to learn from the mistakes that often come through those risks. And in the Émile, there's a story that I talk about where Émile tries to replicate a trick he saw at a little country fair, and he's able to replicate it, and good for him. But in doing so, he takes it back to the fair to try to, in some sense, one up to embarrass the magician who had done the trick. And the magician turns the table on him and ends up embarrassing Émile and his tutor. And then goes back a day later, and explains what Émile had done to him. today, as we read it, we think, oh my gosh, that's so embarrassing. How could you shame a child like that? But for Rousseau, it's not about publicly shaming a child. It's about teaching a child how to appreciate all of the different things that each of us gives to community. So not all of us can be the showy center of attention, but all of us do bring something important to community. And so learning to appreciate what each of us has and how that contributes to the richness that is a communal life is really important. We don't all, in a church picnic or a local neighborhood potluck, we each bring a different dish. They're not always the best dish, and they don't have to be, but in bringing something different, we actually end up with a very rich meal. And I think that's a similar sort of lesson that we're getting from a meal. It's that each of us is unique, is naturally good, but society teaches us to start measuring ourselves and competing with each other to be the best dancer or the best musician or the best singer. And instead, we should put aside the competition and instead try to focus on our unique contributions.
Our guest here on Community Voices Radio Northern Beaches, Sally Scholtz, Professor of Philosophy, on the line from Philadelphia at Villanova University. We're discussing her interests and her recent essay, Learning to be Social, about what we might learn from Rousseau, about how we might live together, and particularly about education from Rousseau's very famous and very long, it must be said, book, Emile. More than half of the book, of course, Sally is devoted to keeping Emile well away from society and as much in nature for natural development for the reasons we've discussed. But the second half sees him coming into society in his late teens, I guess, or maybe in his early 20s, I'm not sure. But at this point, too, he has to, well, I think someone's described it as saying that perhaps he's hopefully been inoculated from some of these woes and corruptions, but he's going to have to confront some of the pressures and social, isn't he? Including desires, including sexual desires that might have been repressed. And so we hear here, particularly about the role of women and his relationship with Sophie, whom he marries. Now, the view of women in Emile generally and their role in all this is, well, it must be said, a little dated, is it?
Yes, that's well said. It is a little bit dated. And if we only read the chapter on Sophie, or the book on Sophie, book 5 of Emile, then we get a sense of women fulfilling a very traditional or particular role in the family and whatnot. But it's important to remember that Rousseau is writing in a historical time period, and women certainly had roles in society and in public. Rousseau himself participated in many salons led by intellectual women to bring together intellectuals and artists and things and have heady conversations. But it is the case that upper class women especially were primarily confined to the home, and he sort of replicates that. However, I think sometimes Rousseau is read, that chapter of Rousseau is read without having read the rest of the book. And one of the things that I would emphasize is that Rousseau sees different virtues in the sexes. So he sees men and women having different virtues, and that strikes a little harsh to our ears today. But Rousseau does not think that one is inferior to another. He just thinks that they are different. And so I think sometimes Rousseau is held up as a model of Enlightenment sexism, and I would want to push back against that a little bit and say, oh, I think there's more to that story. And that Rousseau is certainly a product of his time, but he is crafting Sophie just as he crafted Emile as an ideal woman of nature. And I think Mary Wollstonecraft has an excellent criticism of Rousseau. Where Rousseau went wrong is in seeing women's nature. He mistook what counts as women's nature.
Well, I think even if I'm not mistaken, Jane Austen in Emma, I think Jane Austen said to have been a bit of a, I don't know, devotee, a fan, but a bit of a follower of Rousseau to start with. But I think she too might have come to the view that some of his views perhaps were a little bit dangerous.
Yes, exactly right.
But on this question of gender, I mean, the quotes are very strong, and he's a man that's full of aphorisms, of course, and a man who can write such wonderful aphorisms gets quoted and misquoted all the time. But man must be energetic and strong, and women passive and weak. But one of the main points he makes there is that man is responsible for educating the woman. This is a theme in Emma too, isn't it, about educating women?
Right, and he says something also that directed toward Sophie, that Sophie, take your father's religion until you have Emile, and then you take Emile's religion, and that sort of thing. Yes, and so what do you want me to say about that? I can't defend Rousseau on on these marks. I will say, however, that just as there is this line of that Emile will be your teacher, there is a similar line that Emile is learned from Sophie. And part of what she teaches is some of the lessons of the heart. And here I mean how to, Rousseau was very cautious of our passions and our desires because he saw how easily they led us astray. But he also recognized that passion or feeling was an important source of knowledge. And so Sophie, in being perhaps more attuned to human feeling, and she studied humanity, as he puts it, or human relations. In being more attuned to human relations, she could teach Emile about being humane.
His education is against the backdrop, I think, of society, that he feels that people in society and man in society is actually alienated from himself by all these practices of self-absorption and vanity. And I think there's a quote, "The man of the world almost always wears a mask," and he's even at war with himself. He pays a price for all of this. Humanity pays a price, according to Rousseau, don't they?
Yes, exactly right. And in the Emile, he talks about educating, as we said, educating the man of nature. Toward the end, he says we've educated the man of nature to be a good citizen. That's distinct from the man of society. And it's the man of society is the man who is measured by vanity and is too concerned about the opinions of others. Rousseau wants to, as he says, unmoor or unshackle, to release the chains or the bonds of society on each of us as human beings so that we can be free. It's incredibly important, this education, so that we can then participate in a society. But Rousseau also talks about needing to find the right society. So at the end of Emile is sent off on what we might call world travels, or to learn about different government systems in order to find the best possible government system to fit his own education. Also need to society that is capable of accommodating or honoring all of these good citizens. Definitely an idealistic picture.
Well, it could be said to be a speculative picture too, rather than a prescription for how to actually do things, and a vision perhaps. But as you said in your essay that we've been discussing, titled "Learning to be Social," humans need to learn to be social. And I guess he's trying to argue that the way we learn at the moment isn't in our own interest. This dreadfully strong quote, "We go through life struggling and hesitating and die before we have found peace, useless alike to ourselves and to others." His project, though, is to convert what he sees, and I think this is a noble savage, into an integrated citizen, isn't it? And that's what his book about education tries to paint a vision of, isn't it?
Right, exactly. Create type of citizens that we are able to be. Society has told us how to be, and he wants us to discover ourselves in our freedom, how to be and how to be together as society.
And do you think there's a value and relevance still for us in this day and age in the sorts of points we've been discussing, and that he sets out at great length in his speculative vision about an ideal person and society?
I agree, and I like your words speculative there. Rousseau recognizes that this is not a moral prescription, but I do think he is one of these scholars who thinks that other scholars have gotten things wrong. And so he's at least in part responding to some of the other social contract theorists especially. And so if we can look at those parts of the Emile and social contract where Rousseau thinks he's gotten things right, or he's put things right, and especially with valuing freedom. And if freedom is more than just a characteristic that the laws of society are set up to guarantee, it's actually part of our nature. It's part of what it means to be human. And that's what dangerous education that measures us against one another, or that is subject to public opinion, fails to recognize. The education in accordance with nature is trying to recognize the value of being free.
Well, what a great resounding note, flourish and call and vision to end on. Thank you so much for joining us, Sally Scholtz, all from Villanova University in Pennsylvania, where Sally is the professor of philosophy. And we've been talking about Rousseau's classic work about education, basically, Emile. Thank you so much for joining us here on Radio Northern Beaches, Sally.
Oh, thank you, Michael. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Australia, the lucky country. We've got meat pies. We've got the world's best beer. But most importantly, top of the list, we've got Radio Northern Beaches 88.7, 90.3. Now hitting the entire world on www.rnb.org.au.